Hello, everyone. My name is Mais Saadani, and I'm the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, The War in Sudan, 2 Years On. As our audience may know, April 15 will mark 2 years since the war in Sudan broke out between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, leaving Sudanese civilians caught in the middle. Estimates suggest that as many as 150,000 people may have been killed, more than 12 million displaced from their homes, and 30.4 million currently in need. Despite numerous attempts to bring the warring parties to the negotiating table, there's been no success. It's a dark anniversary that we're coming up on, but it's an incredibly important conversation, and it's my pleasure to be introducing you to your moderator, Megdi Amin, who is a member of TIMEP's Board of Advisors. He's also a Sudanese American adjunct professor at SAIS and managing partner of African Renaissance Partners. He focuses on harnessing the power of markets, technology, and investment to give people agency and lives of dignity. Megdi will introduce our speakers and he'll get the conversation started. Thank you, Megdi.
Thank you, Mai. It is a great pleasure to moderate this, but as you said, it's something that has been weighing heavily on all of our hearts, those who know Sudan, who've worked in Sudan, or Sudanese, or from the region. So it is for me also, having worked in Sudan during the transitional period when we were hoping to lead to democracy. It's extremely bitter to see all of the destruction, but then even raises how important it is to have this conversation and keep the dialogue going. We have three great panelists. Really appreciate their time and everybody who's joined. Dalia Abdelmonem is a Sudanese political analyst and commentator with very extensive experience in media, civil society, activism. And she's been in both business and media, and will have great observations for us. Mohamed Al-Noor is also a human rights lawyer with nearly 20 years of experience advocating for human rights and legal reforms, represented prominent clients and collaborated with local international organizations, really pushing for accountability. Mike Brand is a human rights, atrocities prevention, and peace-building professional with over 15 years of experience in policy, advocacy, and education, worked with NGOs and other organizations in the United States, Rwanda, South Sudan, and supporting civil society and diaspora networks. So bring these different contrasting, overlapping, and interesting perspectives to bear on this conversation. We'll encourage everyone in the audience to submit questions. Think of them now, and maybe in about 20, 30 minutes, after we've had some discussion, we'll start to turn to your questions and make this more interactive. With that, let's go ahead and get started. We'll start with really talking about where we are today in the conflict and what are the impacts, just to get everybody sort of up to speed, let's say. A lot of us follow this very carefully. Recently, Dalia, we've seen scenes of the jubilation as SAF took Khartoum, but there are also really horrific videos. We've seen signs of sort of radicalization, retribution, and there's a lot of fragmentation on all sides of the conflict. Where are we today, 2 years in? Or is this, the beginning of the end, or is this really just a beginning to a much longer protracted conflict?
Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. Actually, I don't think we're either at the end or at the beginning. We're still stuck in the quagmire of a war. Even though Khartoum was recaptured, there's still plenty of other places in Sudan that are seeing fierce fighting. Darfur is now, I would imagine, it to be the next battle royale, so to speak, between both sides. And there have been numerous reports that the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, are increasing their attacks around Al-Fashir in North Darfur. That's the only last standing city that's not under the control of the RSF. And as you've mentioned, there's so many atrocities that have been uncovered, committed by the RSF, and also atrocities being committed by militia allied to the Sudanese armed forces. And so it brings us to a situation where we have such a mix, a pool of so many different groups and so many different militias involved. And there are extremists as well from the SAF side, just like there are extremists in the RSF side. And this huge pool will only get bigger the longer this war drags on. And every day more atrocities are being discovered and uncovered and reported and documented. And we're a long way away from reaching some form of resolution or finding some end to this war. And even if we do, the fallout from this war will continue to reverberate for a long time. So how do we as Sudanese society and political actors and civil society actors work to combat this? And this is something I feel that we haven't actually addressed, and we should be starting to look into how we should address it. So we need to be prepared for what happens next.
No, but well put. Yes, the kind of ethnic and other fragmentation that we see really, I agree, it gets worse over time. This was a much more solvable conflict at the beginning, or certainly before it, but I worry about the deep sort of fissures that are kind of also pushed by propaganda, about sort of the ethnic nature of some of that dialogue as well. So Mike, let's turn to you. We often have to make a case for paying attention to Sudan. What is the strategic importance of Sudan in your view, particularly given its position along the Red Sea corridor as a gateway to Sahel and Central Africa? And how has that strategic position of Sudan influenced the conflict?
Thanks, Magdi. Yeah, I mean, I think as much as Sudan is an internal power struggle between SAF and the RSF, it's also an external power struggle with very different, states that are involved. All, as you said, because of, Sudan's strategic location and interest for natural resources and other things. It would take probably too long for me to unpack all the different elements that are at play here. So just like highlighting a few that I think are probably most key to what's been going on. The United Arab Emirates, the UAE, has been deeply connected with the RSF, supplying arms to the RSF in exchange for gold that RSF is mining and exploiting from Darfur. Saudi Arabia is sitting right across from the Red Sea from Sudan, and having a really strong relationship, wanting to have a strong relationship with the government for security reasons and that Red Sea corridor, as you said. The KSA has also led or tried to lead several attempts of these negotiations that sort of failed, but also we've heard from several different partners that along the way, when other governments were trying to exert some pressure and trying to be more involved in the process, the KSA was trying to keep them at arm's length and was really trying to, strong arm and control that process. And so that may have, as you said, Magdi, like the earlier days of this conflict, may have hindered, a chance for peace. Both the UAE and KSA have partnered with RSF in the past, with proxy wars in Yemen, further helping to supply arms and support and strengthen the RSF over the years. Russia has backed both sides in the past, previously supporting the RSF in exchange for gold that Russia was using in part to help fuel its war in Ukraine. More recently supporting SAF, playing both sides, but Russia's been very interested in getting access to a port in Sudan so that they have access to the Red Sea corridor. And not only Russia, but also Iran. Iran's been very interested in building that relationship with Sudan, getting access to the Red Sea corridor from the West, which if they had that, access, then they would basically be able to control both sides to some degree of that corridor, because on the other side you have, the tail end of Yemen, and Iran has been supporting and directly partnering with the Houthis. Something that the Trump administration has been very focused on. And we can talk about, that as a whole separate conversation of, the recent bombings that have been, conducted in Yemen, and the war crimes being committed there. But this idea that the Trump administration is being focused on Iran and the Red Sea corridor, but not really taking into account Sudan's role in that and where Sudan fits, is kind of a strategic miscalculation right now. And then, as you said, across the Sahel, there's been many years of violent extremism, terrorism that has been on the rise, multiple different, UN efforts, France, US, others have been involved, regionally, African states have been involved. But, across the Sahel, many of those states don't have access to a major port. And so, if you look at a map, across the Sahel, at the tail end of that, you have Sudan. And so if there's some kind of relationship that's, built between some of these different actors, allowing for, ease of flow of arms and other, resources in and out, could be, make things much worse. And then, to the south, you have South Sudan, which is on the brink of its own, civil war, return to full-scale civil war, which, as you all know, a lot of the people have been crossing the borders in both directions over these years. And so for much of what's going on, it's not just, how it's impacting the people in country, but also across the country. And so insecurity and, instability in Chad for many of the refugees that are, currently in, from Darfur, insecurity and instability in South Sudan for many that are been flowing across the border in both directions. All of this just, connects back to the need for, a stable peace. And then, a total other kind of can of worms is the Abraham Accords and some of the work that Trump had done in his first term to establish more normalization with the state of Israel. Obviously, a lot of that has changed in a post-October 7th world. But, trying to make those determinations of, the Trump administration and how that will, determine who they negotiate with within Sudan, to see how that, a key piece of their foreign policy will be continuing that normalization with Israel.
You're right. A complicated set of actors and external ones. I've sort of categorized them into those, particularly Saudi Arabia and Egypt and I'd say Ethiopia, Eritrea, who are South Sudan, who are longstanding neighbors who have an interest in the stability of Sudan, some of which may want it on sort of more or less their terms, but I think it's clear that instability affects them most directly, and so they're most interested in stability, whereas you have another set of actors are more or less opportunistic or looking for either specific resources, not immediate neighbors, but so let's say the Russia and Iran and the even maybe the Abraham Accords was more or less something that was sought for Sudan for a particular purpose, as opposed to the interests in a stable Sudan. So let's keep going. I really appreciate that. We could have gone along. We could spend this entire time thinking about how external actors have played into this conflict, but let's get back a little bit closer to the people. Muhannad, we all have seen the statistics. Is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, in some ways also the deepest when you see the multidimensionality of it. But it's not a new crisis. It has been most of Sudan's history at some level of conflict. And can you discuss the challenges of ensuring accountability, particularly given now the gender-based violence and the war crimes and the genocide determination? What steps are needed to protect civilians and ensure a future accountability or accountability now, so this is not a continuous cycle?
Thank you so much, Mehdi. Sadly, we are marking the second year of the war, but the hope is all our efforts to end and to stop the war once and for all succeed. exactly as you said, this is not the first time. The crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide have been committed for Sudan in quite a long time. Same atrocities were committed in South Sudan in the 80s and 90s, in Darfur since 2003 2004, in Blue Nile and South Kordofan, Nuba Mountain since 2011. And very recently, the massacre of June the 3rd in Khartoum and other cities in Sudan. Still, the victims are far more from justice. Impunity encourages more immunities. And that's why this war is built on the bed of impunity. It was really heartbreaking listening to the Sudan representative at the International Court of Justice this morning, accusing RSF, or rightly accusing RSF and UAE of genocide in Darfur, which is, I believe, it is undeniable. However, the same complainer committed the same crime some 20 years ago, and still, again, the perpetrators are still free, and victims are far from seeing justice. And this war, as we might highlight later, is a war on civilians. Even though the international humanitarian law, the cornerstone of the international humanitarian law is to protect civilians, especially vulnerable groups like women, girls, children, and minorities. But both SAF, the Sudanese army, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, failed to comply with international law. Just this morning, the Amnesty International published a horrific report about the atrocities that the RSF committed: gang rape, sexual enslavement, like raping even mother after tearing away her breastfeeding, with reports by UNICEF that children as young as 1 year old were raped. This is unseen. You know, the scale of the atrocities in this war is unbelievable, and any single crime you could think of have been committed in this war. Last December, there was the 288% rise in the demand of the gender and sexual-based violence. Still, there's so many undocumented crimes and cases, especially like forced marriage, for example. Even though with tens of documented cases, still the number of the real cases is really high. Another minority is like Christians, who have been discriminated against even before the war, but within this war, that were intentionally targeted by two belligerents, by SAF and RSF. In the very early days of the war, RSF attacked almost every church and church building in Khartoum, the capital. They looted the churches, destroyed these churches. They forced some priests to convert to Islam, while SAF intentionally bombed many churches in Khartoum. In Wad Madani, for example, RSF set some churches in fire. They forced a whole village of Thora Mobi, for example, to convert to Islam. And those who managed to escape, they were arrested by SAF for being affiliated, allegedly affiliated with RSF. At the IDBs, within IDBs, there's also some difficulties for Christians. They have been forced to display surface times only because they're Christians, especially if they were from Nuba Mountain, and fundamental rights were violated, like the right to walk and the right to worship. Again, it is a war on civilian, and every single civilian is affected by this war, but it's essential to highlight those who live in a crisis within the crisis. But it is, again, as you said, this is not the first time. Accountability is really significant step in achieving stability, not to see these crimes committed again and again and again. So I would say accountability is a key for stability.
Yes, as much as we've seen all of these reports and numbers, you really brought home the brutality of it. I know war is never anything but brutal, but sometimes hearing about, we all know people. I just saw, somebody I knew had been tortured. Somebody who, is an important person in the startup community in Sudan, and kind of part of a potentially bright future, had died after being tortured. It was just awful, and we all have had family members who've been displaced and lived through these conditions. So let me just ask you, just continuing with you, the civilians and the diaspora have been mobilized. A lot of them are providing help, but in specifically with respect to accountability and protection, what can civilians and the diaspora do to affect more accountability?
Well, civil society actors, especially in the diaspora, have a role in voicing those who drop and can't, for every reason, can't speak. So we must firmly stand against the war and against the impunity. And this includes condemning violence against civilians committed by both parties. We have seen many civil society are divided. Those who are like pro-SAF, close eye to any crimes committed by them, and sometimes even blaming the victims. And those who are pro-RSF, again, turn eye of any atrocities and blame victims of SAF. So this is very important for us to be honest and to document these crimes and to support those who are in the ground to document these crimes. With the new situation that you expose, there is many human rights defenders in the ground affected, but still we have a role to play. So this is very important, first of all, and the international community also must play its role in protecting civilians, which is a big failure. And as I said, accountability is crucial, and it would bring stability and generate no repetition of these crimes. One of the key things that the civil society have been doing to document these crimes and to be in touch with the fact-finding mission, for example, who reported many crimes committed by both parties. And I would really would like here to appreciate the work of the fact-finding mission and encourage everyone to support this work. And this is the first step to bring those perpetrators to justice. With the new development, we see the international mechanism are not really working in Sudan. The victims of the genocide and therefore having seen justice for more than 20 years. The same perpetrators who have been committed the same crimes are still in power, or some of them are still in power. And also the ICC jurisdiction is only limited to Darfur. And there is no way the crimes committed outside the Darfur would be seen or investigated by the International Criminal Court, even though most of these crimes fall under the jurisdiction of the court. And it's highly unlikely for the UN Security Council to extend the work of this of the ICC, even though this is one of the recommendations from a fact-finding mission. So I would say the domestic laws could work, and this might look very optimistic. And many were saying the same about Bashir. They thought Bashir would never be like brought to justice for his crimes, but we saw Bashir behind the bar with the co-perpetrators after the transition, during the transition government. But we lacked the documentation. We weren't really prepared to hold him accountable for crimes like genocide, like other crimes. because we lack the preparation, we lack the documentation. So I would say documentation is very significant, and we need to work hard to document all these crimes. And I could possibly see justice inside Sudan. I think this is the one of the to be like practically speaking, this is the way forward. But this can't be done with the militias. And as Dalia said, there is so many militias in Sudan. Militias affiliated with SAF, militias affiliated with RSF. So we have to dissolve all of this militia. And over 6 years, civilians have been protesting against these militias and calling for the demolition, the dissolving of all these militias, in particular the RSF. However, the SAF empowered RSF and created even more militias.
That's right. So thank you, Muhammad. The key point on documentation applies whether it's 1, 2, or 20 armed forces. There's no accountability unless especially in a space that's full of propaganda and misinformation, that it is very important to document. And I think that is something that civilians and communities outside can do, can help with anyway, can support. So I appreciate that, and the more insight you provided on the complexities of it. On that note, let's go to Dalia. Do you see a window where the current dynamics could lead to more space for civil society to play a constructive role in getting to peace, and perhaps on the accountability or other mechanisms sustaining peace?
I mean, civil society is our best hope. And even though the space for civil society in Sudan now, it's getting smaller and it's getting more narrow by the day, we have to force ourselves to be included. Unfortunately, all past, negotiations and meetings that have been held, they have tended to exclude civil society and only include them when it's to do with the humanitarian side. The civil society needs to be involved in the political process as well. We have to be there for the peace negotiations. We have to be there for the nation building blocks, all of that. But for some unknown reason that I can't even comprehend, they keep getting excluded. And it's not just happening now, it's been happening even during the post-coup period, when there were discussions with the UNITAMs and the Norway and UK and EU and so on. And I remember at one point, they were actually, civil society, especially the youth groups, were told to stop being so optimistic or to be so idealistic that they should compromise their demands. That compromise is one of the many reasons as to why we're in this current quagmire that we're in of this war. So civil society, and let's not forget, throughout this war, it's civil society, groups like the emergency room responders who have actually kept the country. They've been acting like the state, even though they've been facing so many restrictions and blockades and detainment, prosecution, torture, all of that, arrest, but they've continued to do the job that the state has failed because the state collapsed. And so civil society has a major role to play, and that's something that needs to be put at the front, if someone is going to, but the thing is, neither side is going to put forward the civil society. Civil society has to push itself. They have to make it so obvious that they cannot be ignored any longer, whether it's the women's group, whether it's the youth groups, whether it's the professional syndicates, unions. I mean, let's not forget it was civic society that actually led to the revolution, not just the revolution against al-Bashir, but also the 1983 revolution against President Nimeri. So civic society has a...
And 1964.
I wasn't born then, but I do remember the Nimeri one in 83.
Me neither, but yes.
So civic society has always been resisting, has always been the bloc that has pushed for change. And yet it's the same bloc that has been continuously ignored and excluded. And that is a major mistake that has been committed time and time again throughout all these meetings and negotiations that have been held for the past 2 years specifically. And so I think it comes down to that maybe civic society should be better unified, should be a more unified bloc in order to push forward the fact that we need to be included, we need to be a part of the process, that we're not an afterthought. And that's something that we, especially all of us, those of us who can, especially those of us in civic society in the diaspora, who can actually have more room to maneuver, to talk, to negotiate, to use that platform. Because those who are in Sudan are busy trying to keep people alive, are
Yes.
busy trying to, get medical aid to those who need it most, provide shelter, and so on and so forth. And that's where I think also if there's any members of the international community who are, in this webinar today, they should make a note of that. Do not exclude civil society. It's not just the political parties. It's not just the two armies. It is the people. And civil society is the best bloc to represent the people because, like Muhammad said, this is a war on civilians. And it's civilians who have been paying the price. And they need to be included.
Thank you for that. I have to agree that in this whole awful period, there's not a lot of parties that have sort of rained a lot of glory on themselves in how they've acted or been effective. But the one group I would have to say that has been civil society, and particularly the emergency response rooms, have shown themselves to be the true patriots, to be honest. So I thank you for calling them out. Maybe if we could, on that point, turn to Mike. We've seen the humanitarian aid cuts. I know there are some exceptions, but nonetheless, what USAID has done and what we see signs of from Europe as well in some cases, what are the implications of reduced international humanitarian aid and assistance on civil society, on mobilization, in addition to, of course, the impact on saving lives through, the hunger crisis?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think obviously most of the world did not see the dissolution of US aid happening this quickly and how that would impact not just Sudan, but the entire world. Sudan, as Mohammed said, there's been horrible atrocities and everything, but, Sudan has been called the worst humanitarian displacement, hunger, and education crisis in the world. And so there's multiple different issues that are happening at the same time, all of which, need support. And so what we saw with USAID, on Trump's first day in office, pausing all foreign aid with, the exception of military aid to Israel, that was paused supposed to be for 90 days, but very quickly it became clear that the real goal was to just get rid of USAID entirely. And initially after some backlash from some members of Congress and NGOs and individuals, they did issue those waivers, as you said, but these waivers were granted in name only, really, for many of these programs. And so what you saw was a disconnect between internal processes within government, how, USAID actually functions, how money gets out the door, how procurement works, and the people that were running these programs. And so we're saying, yes, waivers can go forward for life-saving aid, but what did that mean in practice? If you can get food and, pay for food to go to somewhere like Sudan that, is experiencing, famine and food insecurity at mass scale, but then you're not funding the trucks that are going to bring the food to the people that need it, or the boats that are going to bring the food to, the port in Sudan, then the food waiver doesn't really mean anything. The other side of this is, many of these implementing partners, and even, the local actors like the ERRs, USAID funding, it's not exclusively USAID funding, but they don't always give all the money up front. And so you're doing work before you get paid back for the things that you've bought or the work, the people that you're paying to do the work. And so when this pause started, even after these waivers went through and USAID started to say, okay, go ahead, you can continue to do, more humanitarian aid or more programming, a lot of the NGOs were not trusting that money would come through, and they couldn't afford to, foot the bill initially and then, not guarantee that they would get paid back. So there's a big gap, initially, and obviously it's still going on. As you said, European partners and others are also trying to start pull back on some of the foreign assistance, partially due to some, defense spending issues, given what's going on with Russia and Ukraine and the US's change in stance there. But, there's a lot of other challenges as well. And, we've seen historically strong bipartisan support in Congress, at least, for Sudan generally, but also especially for humanitarian assistance. But we haven't seen a lot of public pressure from Congress. The Republicans hold both the House and the Senate. There hasn't been a hearing, calling Secretary Rubio or Pete Morocco or somebody to testify and explain exactly what's going on, exactly how this process is going to work. How are they going to move USAID programming under the State Department as they've, stated in writing. So, this is a real challenge where nobody really knows what's going to happen next. And foreign aid, at least from the US government side, is not something you can just flip on and flip off. There's a long process by which, there's vetting and there's programs, there's, individuals that are going through all this, the paperwork. And so it's not as simple as, okay, well, we'll take this program from USAID, put it under the State Department, and then it'll restart. It's not going to work that way. And even at State Department, they don't have people in place to manage those grants. And so they're going to have to hire new people to do that. And so we've seen, many, organizations locally on the ground, whether they're international NGOs, Sudanese-led organizations, ERRs, having to pull back, not being able to provide as much food, not being able to provide as much medical care, and, just not being able to provide for the people, as Dalia said, that, SAF and the, government of Sudan has been unable to do itself. And the challenge too is that it's not just the humanitarian situation in Sudan. It's also, as I said before, refugees that are living in Egypt, in South Sudan, in Chad, etc. So support for neighboring countries, support for the conflict-related sexual violence, that Mohammed mentioned, the psychosocial support. I mean, every time I have a conversation with Sudanese, everybody brings up, there's been 2 genocides in 20 years. We've seen, multiple mass atrocities across the country. We've seen all this displacement. There's a long road ahead of psychosocial support, but even right now, there's just very little funding for that. And it's not just the humanitarian, as you said, right? It's the documentation, it's the civil society programming, it's the investigations, it's supporting the fact-finding mission, supporting the hopeful, accountability eventually one day. And what's so frustrating, as Dalia said as well, civilians rose up to topple a 30-year dictatorship. The young people, women were on the front lines of those protests, demanding freedom, equality, civilian rule. And then after, they were on the front lines, promoting civilian rule once the military leaders were trying to take over. And then now they're on the front lines of providing humanitarian aid and the evacuation efforts and the documentation efforts. And like, these are the people that could be the future of Sudan, like in a new government, in a new, positions of power within private sector, et cetera. And it's not only the war that's now robbing, the Sudan's future, it's also these funding cuts. All these kids that are out of school, all these kids that are, malnourished, that's going to have generational impacts.
Yes, for sure, for sure. No, this is the kind of trauma that gets passed down across generations. My wife is a psychotherapist and researcher in this space, and that's pretty well documented that there will be intergenerational trauma, and intervening now is the best way to prevent that. And yet, at the same time, these resources are being cut. And let me also just appreciate it's not only that the cuts directly, the impact of those cuts on the population, but also the loss of resources, the loss of ability of the U.S. government to play that role, the talent and depth of understanding of the crisis of those people who were supporting U.S. government's efforts to be constructive in such a situation. Those are all, very painful to watch as well. I would like to sort of start segueing into more audience questions and encourage you to submit some more questions. Before doing so, maybe Dalia, if you could, we see the announcement of the upcoming London conference. There's been so many failed negotiations in the past. What have we learned from this litany of unsuccessful attempts, and what does it mean for those prospects for this upcoming conference?
Well, the thing is, every time they've had these negotiations or these conferences, neither side have come to the table willingly. But the situation is turned now because on the war front, SAF has made major incursions into RSF-held territory. And that's given them, that's bolstered their morale, that's bolstered their standing, they believe. And at the same time, it's like the carrot and stick, nothing has been offered to either side to actually want to bring an end to this war, so to speak. And the gold smuggling is continuing, the arms race is continuing. Nothing has stopped for either side to encourage them to actually enter negotiations. And at the same time, those who have been, puppeteering these negotiations, they've also, like you mentioned earlier, they've had their own ulterior motives. And so you have SAF saying, I will not be there if RSF is going to be present. And then RSF saying, well, we'll only go if these conditions are met. And both sides have continuously violated the conditions, for example, that were set in Jeddah. With the upcoming London one, I think most probably there'll be behind closed door discussions, because this is, if I'm not mistaken, this conference has been labeled as follow-up to the Paris humanitarian funding one. So it's more humanitarian than political, so to speak. But the UAE is invited, Egypt is invited, I think Qatar and Saudi as well. And so most probably there'll be negotiation under the table. And again, civil society is being relegated to the subcommittees, not the main ones. And so I don't hold my hopes on any conferences or any meetings bringing any resolution anytime soon, simply because neither side are willing to negotiate. And I also ask, would the Sudanese people accept negotiations? Would they be happy? What incentives have there been given to the RSF to lay down their arms? What incentives have been given to SAF to ensure that they have somewhat immunity? I mean, that's always been their main fear, that they are not held accountable for their actions. And so there's all these, and at the same time, there's no one that's actually championing the Sudan case. Not one country or one entity that's come out and saying, we will champion Sudan and ensure that there is some resolution found. And it's just all these like very lackluster efforts, mediation efforts that I've, for me, they're very lackluster. So I don't hold my hopes up. I think the only way this war will reach an end is if the backers of both army and SAF are basically pulled up by the scruff of their necks and told, do something, end it. But until that happens, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, simply because the way politics works and how the role of the UAE and how they are so interwoven within the international community. And also you have countries that back SAF, but actually don't want to push the boat so much. I'm talking about Egypt, for example. Saudi seems to, there was a post that Rubio met with his Saudi counterpart. So, like I said, I hold no hopes for these talks to bring about anything. But if they bring about more humanitarian assistance, then I'm all for that. But in terms of the politics, you still have the role of the Islamists. They never left. They never went away. How do you deal with that? Within those Islamists, you have the extreme Islamists that, the so-called, Salafis that has blown up, ballooned in Sudan, their role. How do you counter that? Like we mentioned earlier, the different ethnic and tribal groups that are also involved in this war. How do you deal with that? How do you pacify them? How do you give them a piece of the cake without compromising the whole structure and the whole setup of Sudan, so to speak? And until all those small details, nuances are actually dealt with directly, then we'll just continue. They'll just keep meeting in wonderful cities, have beautiful lunches, and then come back and say, we'll meet again in a few months' time, and then repeat. again and again. So I'm very
Okay,
disappointed.
I think
I
you're
don't hold my hopes up for that.
okay. I think you've been pretty clear about that. Thank you. And I can't disagree, to be honest. I think your point on the incentives are not there, have not been there. The complication of that is that within SAF and within RSF, there are multiple not entirely aligned views or stakeholders, and now there are multiplicity of actors. So if you try to focus on, which I do think was the right approach, more or less outside in, focus on the external groups, and they are defined groups. It's not one country or even several countries. They're groups of countries that form the incentives to continue that need to be really at the center of direct discussions, not necessarily roundtables, but bilateral deal making. But it requires somebody to actually invest and commit the kind of time and power needed to get that done, and that hasn't happened. So maybe if I could just turn to Mike before we turn to questions, Mike and Mohammed. Mike, any further views on the prospects for negotiations or the international community to play a role in influencing peace rather than conflict?
Yeah, I think you both said almost all of it. I think the key thing, as you just said, is that it's not in general, you would think having peace in Sudan would be in the best interest of all parties. But for certain individuals, for certain external governments, it's actually in their interest to keep Sudan in a little bit of chaos because they can benefit more, or they believe they can benefit more from that. And so the incentives, and disincentives aren't exactly there for them yet. And this is where, the US government and, other external governments don't have a lot of pressure necessarily directly over SAF and RSF. And as you said, it's not even, as if those are monolith individual, entities. There's multiple other factors under that. But there is pressure that the US could exert over the actors that are providing arms and support to both actors. And we've seen some nascent efforts, in the U.S. to from Congress at least, to try to do this, at least with the UAE, given that the U.S. has said that, genocide is occurring in Darfur perpetrated by the RSF, and you can connect the dots between if the UAE is providing arms to the RSF, then they can be complicit in that genocide. But the SAF is also committing atrocities, and so the individual governments that are providing arms, UAE, Egypt, Turkey, others, the U.S. does have strong defense partnerships with them, and so there is more pressure that could be exerted, or threats of pressure at least, because as Dali said, like holding them up by the scruff of their necks. Like I think drying out the flow of arms is one of the main ways to get some kind of negotiating table. And I think the challenge that we have to learn from the Darfur peace processes, from the failed, efforts and negotiations in South Sudan too, is it's not just SAF and RSF. There's other actors that need to be in the room, especially, civil society, women, youth groups, all these groups, but also all these different armed actors and people that have a stake in this, because SAF doesn't have full command and control over all the folks that have arms, and RSF doesn't have full command and control over all the folks that have arms. So it's a much wider problem that it is as we enter the third year of the war today, to solve all that. And it's just, the longer this continues, we can find other, mutual aid, support. We can find other Europeans to maybe, fund a little bit of funding the London conference. It's important to do, the humanitarian, but really getting to how do you end this conflict is the key. Because even if we had all the money in the world throwing at Sudan for humanitarian efforts, you'll always need more if the war continues.
Exactly. And yeah, there is, saving lives first, but that there has to be, I think there was a two-track process, but the ending the war track hasn't gained traction because the incentives just were never properly applied, because there were always other priorities that took place. So that's we're not getting very hopeful, to be honest. I think I would love to ask Mohammed, what gives you hope? You know, you work on atrocities and you know, let's say that your work is by necessity sort of looking at the dark side of what happens in some of these conflicts. So maybe in that way, let me ask you, what gives you hope? If it gives you hope, it's got to give all of us hope.
Yeah, just before that, I just wanna echo what you all said about the sideline the civilians, and I think the civilians, because they possess a threat more than the armed movements, and we have seen that during Bashir time, they couldn't oust Bashir for 3 decades. Bashir managed to play the game well with them, but with the civilians managed to oust Bashir, and this gives me hope.
Okay.
Civilian will continue the revolution. They will continue their demands. But there is many issues, as you have all said now, beyond Sudanese. The intervening countries must be stopped. And we have a UN Security Council resolution in hand now to end the siege in Al-Fashir. Just an example, Al-Fashir on siege for more than now since May, with atrocities committed every day. So the UN Security must do something to protect civilians and respect its own resolution. But I am full of hope, and I believe as soon as this war end, civilians will not be silent. Civilians who are now, as Daria said, who are the de facto government, who are running the country while these two parties are busy fighting. It's, don't want to say it's funny, but it's weird. We entering the third year with the now Sudan has a case before the ICJ, but the state has never stopped. The trade between Sudan and UAE have never stopped. It's still going on. The trade between SAF and RSF inside Sudan has never stopped. So these questions must be asked. But I'm full of hope. The emergency rooms, the resistance committees, the revolutionary forces, the all this give me great hope.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that does give us hope. You know, like Sudan has been in it's like misgoverned for most of its independent history, but the people have never, ever stopped wanting freedom and agency and decent lives, and lost their desire to take on governments that do not do not support that reality, and have always won. And so I agree with that. And I turn to Dalia as well. I think you've already said a lot about the emergency response rooms. If there's anything else that gives you hope in this moment?
The youth, Sudanese
Okay.
youth, in whatever capacity they're in,
Yep.
they've always given me hope. And I think also the resilience. I mean, with all the excuse my language, all that we have witnessed as Sudanese since independence till today, the resilience has kept us going. And at times it does feel that, you know, we're at breaking point, but we somehow just regroup and get back at it again. Like I'm seeing it now in Khartoum, for example. I keep getting all these messages from people telling us, I'm going to see your house. What would you like me to collect for you? You know, so they've pivoted from, you know, they've been under siege for 2 years, but those who are still there, they're doing their part now. They're helping to clean up. They're helping people to lock up their houses. And this is something to me that is just the essence of who we are as Sudanese, even though we also have a lot of, you know, faults and shortcomings. But those two things, Sudanese resilience and the youth, they will always keep me going and give me hope.
Thank you. That's a great note to start segueing, but maybe just I'll add a comment or two. In addition to what they've done on the ground internationally, you're starting to see art and music and culture affected that youth are driving. And also everywhere I travel in my current role, I was in Rwanda recently, and I was at Yale recently giving a talk. And wherever I've gone, I've seen people who have now maybe perhaps for the wrong reasons are now outside of Sudan, but many of them are gaining skills and exposure that Sudan will need in the future. And there's a lot of talent being built. I do think it will be a different place going forward, building on the resilience and hopefully keeping some of the deep cultural assets that Sudan had, but also doing away with some of the chronic long-term issues that held the country back, including, frankly, a lack of that kind of exposure, especially during the period of sanctions, where the window of knowledge and information was constrained. And that's all done. We have a very exposed and still empowered youth. Let's take a look at some of the questions. Mike, don't forget, I will ask you as well what gives you hope, especially with Mandela behind you.
Yeah, I mean, I could say while you're looking at the questions, I can just say quickly, I mean, I've met so many amazing people like from the ERs, from the resistance committees, people that have been on the front lines and continuing to do that work every single day. But to your point, music, art, culture, there was a Nile Nights event here in DC this weekend, a beautiful event bringing so many Sudanese together for music and poetry and, Sudani food and things. But also for me, I think it's while there isn't that, sense of unity amongst civil society yet for what the future of the country is and everything else, there has been more unity than in my mind anytime before, at least, understanding that it's not center periphery. For many years there was center periphery challenges, and for this, current crisis, Sudanese people have been more united for some kind of change together. And I think if we can hold on to that, that's going to help in the future.
Okay, I agree, and thank you for enjoying some Sudanese food as well. What did you particularly like?
There was what's it called? These like little meat dumplings almost that were phenomenal. And I always love the peanut sauce, the spicy peanut sauce. I don't know what it's called, but it's delicious.
Coming more and more Sudanese all the time. Imam, let's see a couple of good questions, many good questions. I think some of which have been kind of addressed, but one here that is complicated but worth digging into. Nicholas asks, civil society should be front and center, but who represents civil society? It's people are struggling with that. And why don't you start with that, Mike and Dahlia?
I'll let Dahlia go first.
All right. I agree. I mean, civil society, like I said, needs to be unified under one umbrella. However, if you look at the youth groups, they do have a collective, they are there. Hamdok is not civil society. Hamdok is a civilian politician. Two different, in my book, two different aspects. On paper, Taqaddum was the best option in regards to counter both the RSF and SAF. But unfortunately, they were compromised and they lost the trust of the Sudanese people. And that is a major loss, because how do you regain it? Especially in light of the fact that several members of Taqaddum have now switched and been part of the new parallel government that was set up by the RSF and its allies. But civil society, they are there, they're scattered. I mean, how civil society right now, they're still functioning. If you look at what's happening with the ERRs, for example, their setup is so amazing, because they have people who are outside who are generating the funding, the money, and then transferring it to those who are still in Sudan. So they do have that hierarchy set up. They do have the, how do you call it? They do have, it's a very fluid setup, so to speak, but they do have their representatives. They do have those blocks, and they need to be included. So even if you start by including, let's say, 5 groups or 10 groups, that's the start. But to completely exclude them, is self-defeating in my book, especially for those who want to conduct, negotiations, peace talks and conferences and so on. But there are, there's a collective of women groups, there's a collective of youth groups, there's a collective of professional syndicates and so on. They are there, So it just needs a little bit of work on the part of the actors who are convening these meetings, but it can be done. It's not impossible in my book. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dalia. Maybe if we could look at this question, it's an anonymous question, but somebody's asking about the odds of a partition with RSF basically controlling the Darfur or the parts of Darfur that it controls and SAF most of the rest, I guess. How do you see the risk of partition?
Shall I go or you go, Dalia?
Yes, please, Mohammed.
Yeah, it is a bit different than the situation in South Sudan. It is completely different. If we think of South Sudan as two countries now, to some extent stable countries, this won't be the situation in Sudan now. It won't be like Libya either, when we have two administrations with kind of stability. The neither RSF or SAF would just say, yeah, we are controlling this side and we are happy with that. This will continue. Now we have, as Dalia said, we have some of the Taqaddum who are part of the Ta'sis, which is now the RSF allies. We have Al-Hilu, the SPLM North, who's also RSF. And they will advance their military operation to extend to take the capital of Nuba Mountain, for example, Kadugli. This war is, we won't have stability. And I don't see we have two countries as in many, or even two administrations. We will see the war continues and continues to the boom.
Okay. Maybe why don't you continue? This is a question of how effective can ICJ actually be? So you've seen nothing substantial happen in the case of atrocities in Gaza. I think really the question is about the ICJ case against the UAE, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Despite the legal arguments and the lack of the jurisdiction, which I believe the case is not strong enough, but the court issued like a prevention decision this morning, which is very interesting. And I think this is what the Sudan, the army would like to achieve, to stop UAE from sending weapon to the RSF, especially if the RSF declare their government, which might happen soon, and then the UAE will have enough justification to say we are not supporting militia anymore, we are supporting a government. So this cut the road to that, but it's still the case itself is not really strong, and the problem is the court or the international law generally lacks the any implementation mechanism. So there's no mechanism to implement any decision from the court, but the countries might take some measurement like sanctions or whatsoever, but there is no legal mechanism to enforce or to implement any decision.
Can I just add something, Magdi?
Yeah, please.
I agree with what Mohammed said, and I think the other challenge is the when the UAE ratified the Genocide Convention, they have an Article 9 reservation, which is basically Article 9 of the convention is what allows the ICJ to adjudicate issues about the Genocide Convention. And so because they have this reservation, there's a chance that the ICJ could just throw the case out saying, well, because they have this reservation, on this issue, they don't have authority. But bigger than that, I think, as Mohammed said before, if the kind of government of Sudan that's bringing this case before the ICJ cares about the people of Darfur and cares about the atrocity crimes that have been committed there, why not send Bashir and Haroon to the ICC? A few months ago at the UN Security Council, when the ICC chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, was there, the Sudanese government said, well, we can't send, Bashir to The Hague right now because we don't have the judicial bodies in place because we're in war. Our judiciary has been, hollowed out from within. But then they also just launched this big judicial case before the ICJ. So it's a little bit of like mixed messages there.
Yeah, no, no, can't disagree with that. That's I think it is a little bit of a quandary. Maybe kind of somewhat related. Global disillusionment with state-led and institutionalized systems now. Many people are turning to grassroots solidarity building across geographies. Can you comment on this overwhelming distrust in governments, both in the global north and south, and how can we organize against coordinated systems of power using CSOs, activists, advocates, and ordinary people at home in the diaspora? It's an anonymous question.
Yeah, I'll answer that.
Sure.
I think as we're seeing with what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine and now in Sudan, the fact is that the sense of lack of activism to achieve something over there. So people have taken it upon themselves to do it. So for Sudan, mutual aid and diaspora funding and grassroots funding, humanitarian, has worked brilliantly, simply because the UN once the war erupted, they were somewhat paralyzed. They could, all these international agencies weren't able to access these, hard to get areas and so on. And at the same time, there were bureaucratic, obstacles put in place by SAF. And so mutual aid, it's a wonderful thing because you're funding directly. There's no in between, so go between, you get the money is going directly to those who are at that center, at that epicenter and helping. And it's just a new format. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And is it distrust? Maybe. But for me, it's just an easier way. It's just direct action. I reach out, money is sent, done, over. And that money is going to a good cause and it's going to help people. And more of that, because it does take away the impediments that have usually worked against, those classical NGOs and INGOs. Not to say these agencies aren't doing amazing work, like MSF, for example, never left Sudan. The Norwegian Refugee Council never left Sudan. They continued to work in Sudan from day one of the war, and they continue to do that. So not all agencies and not all governments are the same, but in Sudan, it's worked. And I think this localization of aid will soon be replicated in a lot of other hotspots because it's the fastest and easiest way to actually make sure the money gets to those who need it the most.
A good point. I mean, I would also take this question at a slightly different level. So for centuries, going back to the Turkey, the colonial period and post-independence, Sudan has been a pretty centralized state, and the dynamic that creates is sort of a zero-sum dynamic based on who's controlling the center. While Sudan's actual issues, which have constantly prevented the resolution of these issues, whether it be economic or political, are primarily local. It's not just peripheral. Peripheral versus state is the model people often, or central is often what people talk about. But I think one of the consequences of this conflict, so having the center actually destroyed, was that we now have a much more decentralized society where a lot more is concentrated or focused on or happening at the local level. And I think while it's not for the right reasons, it is actually ultimately hopefully leading to a different state structure that's much more decentralized, much more oriented toward how people can work in their communities about solving the problems that Sudanese people face and creating opportunities with their education or otherwise. So I do think that so there are multiple levels of let's say distrust, or more or less the failure to really deal with the long-term chronic issues that Sudan has faced since well before independence. There's questions around what's happening on the ground. I hear from people who are now, working out of the east part, that's some of the parts that RSF never controlled, and that actually a lot is happening now. Things are picking up. There's a good effort to try to get a much more fertilizer going on. I think the Norwegians, to your point, have been extremely helpful and constructive, and probably could be leaned on a lot more in terms of advice to resolve the conflict as well. Maybe if we could take on this question of maybe a little bit more on, I think there's a few questions on accountability. There's the questions around what individuals who are emerging as political leaders, does anybody have any sense of idea? Is there a mix or a change in the political equations to who's representing civilians, or at least not the two belligerents? Are there people now that aren't necessarily the ones that we've kind of heard about in the past? Are there new leaders emerging that might be provide a little bit of an anchor for ongoing processes?
I can take that.
Sure.
So, as Daria said earlier, the resistance committees and the emergency rooms on the ground, who are the de facto government, those who are the people who are providing people with food, kind of protection, treatment, and almost everything while everyone is busy fighting. And it's important to say, for more than 30 years, the political parties who dominated the political arena used to make deals with the regime, accept part of the cake, sometimes leave or say ever, while other civil society are completely forgotten. But this has completely changed after the revolution. We have now the resistance committees have their own political charters, with something very new for in Sudan. So it's not only anymore the political parties who are controlling everything. There is people from the grass, from the roots, are setting their demands and writing their political charters, which is really, really inspiring, I would say. So those who are I would say, those are the next leaders. And we don't like someone to come from, as it happened during the transition government, just to come from nowhere and to be the leader. We need to build up our government from the grass, from the local committees up to the high levels. And this is what we have been missing for Sudan in quite a long time. So there is no specific person we can finger point to, but everyone now in Sudan. And when we talk about civil society, and this is one of the questions earlier, we talk about the division. Yes, there is a division. People are divided between SAF and RSF, but million in the ground in Sudan who just busy now with serving the people, with trying to observe what's going on and to carry on. But they're all united. They're united against the war. They're united against RSF. They're united against SAF and its militias, especially the Islamist militias. And this is the hope.
Yeah. Yes. I agree that maybe it's time to stop looking for the one big leader who's going to sort of step in and do this, but it's really more about many leaders at the local level who are really, I think they are leaders. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say, I think this is one of the challenges. The international system is built to work with states and to work with a president or a prime minister. And this has been the challenge over the years when countries, devolve into kind of chaos and there's no clear leadership structure, they try to put it back together. They try to force some kind of leadership to emerge from that. And it doesn't always work out, and I think this is the other challenge is that, countries that have not had democratic structure, have not had diffuse power, have not had federalism, all these different things, you can't build it overnight. And it's, the challenge is that the international system wants it to be built overnight and expects it to be built overnight. And so they do try to look for that one leader, that they can say, okay, well, this is the person that we'll talk to now. And, it's a little frustrating, especially when international actors are willing to talk to multiple armed actors, but then they're not willing to talk to multiple sectors of civil society. And I think we need to fix that problem.
Oh, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Because there is a lot of alignment in civil society against the war, and there are many potential actors who could articulate that case, and I think they are articulating the case. The problem when you've had such a long period, not only of conflict, but of attempts, particularly under the Bashir regime, to make progress that have ultimately failed, is that a lot of the actors, there's a sense of distrust that has sort of naturally emerged from that. And anytime somebody steps forward, it seems like there are 10 people ready to shoot them down. So I think it's a little bit complicated, but I agree that people want to be able to communicate with one actor when that actually might be counterproductive right now. And how do we then bring that voice to the table? Let me ask you for maybe two more questions with the few minutes we have left, and let's kind of be succinct so we can get them both in. Good question on what's the role of misinformation and disinformation in the war and spreading the violence, putting communities at risk and social cohesion. I think that's a big long-term issue to be resolved. Maybe start with while you have the mic, Mike. Let's start with you, and then we go to Dalia and then.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, since before the war, this has been a challenge, right? And this is the pro and con of social media, is that you can share a lot more information rapidly and quickly, and people can get updates, but also you don't always know if that information is trustworthy. And it's hard to validate sometimes. And we've seen that constantly, with reporting of a new massacre or a new this, and you realize it's older reporting, or this person saying something or being with somewhere. And then also even from within, somebody goes and has a conversation with a government, and then now they're being called out for being, a spy or, a leader from something else. And so it's all counterproductive. But there are different efforts. I know the CDAC network in the UK and others, have been hosting Internews, and others have been trying to host more conversations about how to recognize what mis and disinformation looks like, to try to combat that, to be aware of that, so that you're not helping to further spread, this on your own platforms. But yeah, there needs to be better communication structures. And I think we've seen in other countries over the years that they've tried to do, like mass text messages or things like that to make people aware of when things are spreading. But especially when you're cut off from internet communications in country, you don't have that same kind of opportunity to mass message a counter, disinformation messaging. So it's an ongoing challenge, and I think, the more that we can recognize that it's there, the better that people can be aware of it, so this way they're not helping to further spread it.
Any further comments, Dalia or Dalia?
It's hard. It's really hard I mean, I think I spend most of my day asking people, what's the source of this information that you're sending me? And and I personally go on the source who's giving this information and who gave me this information. That plays a big part. But I'm different because I'm Sudanese, so I have access to people who provide info that others may not have. But there are some media outlets that I trust implicitly, like Ayin Network, Beam Reports, There's a Sudan War Monitor. There are several Sudanese-based, platforms that they do provide verified information, and they are trustworthy. And I would recommend people, and there are also certain individuals like reporters who work for other media outlets, for the BBC or for Al Arabiya and so on. Those are people you can definitely, trust implicitly. At the same time, let's not forget, for a long time, foreign media was not allowed access to Sudan. So a lot of the information was taken from social media, word of mouth, and, apps like WhatsApp and so on. But it's getting better. But there are outlets out there that you can implicitly trust, and the information they get is like verified, and they have all the mapping and all the technology that shows you where they got the information from. So I would definitely tell
Thank
people
you.
follow those.
Okay, thank you. You've answered the next question already, so that's great. Mohammed, then I'll give you both questions. So that's the misinformation one, but also the question submitted that if you're trying to get regular updates on the situation on the ground, which organizations or news outlets or pages do you recommend?
I will leave the second question to Dalia, but I second her. Ayn is a very reliable source. But I would want to say the war on social media platforms is not less heinous than war on the ground. It's really, really terrible. It always has its own implication. On the ground, we all remember someone who, like in the UK, gives order to the RSF and who killed the Janina, the wali of Janina, Hamis Bakr. He asked him to hang him in a tree, and they did. They asked him to pull his body, and they did exactly what he says. We have someone else. The hate speech is really, really terrible nowadays, and we have someone who call everyone from what they call the Sea and Nile state or something like that. So everyone from West Sudan, who's from like African origin, is not very welcoming in the northern state, and in result of that, we have seen many crimes committed against people from West Sudan in Kanabi, in Wad Madani. So that the social media plays a very in some very terrible role, and I think this must be like regulated somehow.
Yeah, and I think we, at least for X or Twitter, I think and many of the social media platforms there's less content moderation now rather than more. So I would say you can no longer rely on those platforms to police violence and hate speech. So I think people need to make good choices. I think you've provided some good ones. I would just add maybe there's a few spaces, let's say Twitter Spaces or Blue Sky or others, that where the dialogues are often in Arabic, but I think if you want to get a flavor of what's happening now or what's the conversation like, those are also another source. But they're, obviously people are expressing their point of view and their opinions. It's not necessarily sort of vetted media with, multiple sources of information to verify claims. And there is a tremendous amount of misinformation right now, and very counterproductive for putting together a society that's so multi-ethnic. So thank you for all of those questions. I think we're close to time. You mentioned the Sudan War Monitor, and I was just recently, just looking at it I think it was maybe a month ago, where they put together the pictures of Khartoum. And, so sad, you could see, the road I used to drive to on the way to the Ministry of Finance or Central Bank or others, so shout out to Neil, and you just see the destruction, University of Khartoum turned into a barracks, Tuti Island, just littered with debris. It's so sad, but then you get a bit of nostalgia, and with that nostalgia, a little bit of hope as to, there is tremendous beauty, and the beauty is in the people, and the people are resilient, and they've dealt with a lot in the past, and they've inshallah, they'll deal with this as well and rebuild a place that people have never forgotten and never wanted to do anything but to see those people have a chance for a better life. So thank you, everybody who's joined, submitted questions, and I'm going to turn it back to Mai to wrap up for us. Mai, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Megdi. I want to thank you for that. And before we end, I want to give our speakers and Megdi, if you'd like, each 30 seconds or a minute to leave our audience with some closing thoughts, whether it's something you want to reiterate that came across in today's conversation, or it's something that a call to action that you'd like to leave our audience with. So we'll go in the order of Delia, Mike, Muhannad, and Megdi. I'll let you jump in as well.
I've always said the Sudan war is the ignored war, and I think with the 2-year mark coming up, that's even more pronounced than ever. We seem to be an afterthought when talking about conflicts, even though it is one of the worst conflicts that's being waged right now. But I will say this, like Megdi just said, my hope lies in the people, in the youth, and with everything, whenever you hit that nadir, what goes down must come up. So my only hope is that, with the devastation that's been wreaked across Sudan, that we will rise again in some shape or form, that we will have accountability, because I think that's one of the biggest hindrances that we've had as Sudanese, that we've never held anyone accountable for any of the atrocities committed against us. And for me personally, neither the RSF nor SAF are my friend, or, if anything, they have caused us more grief than anyone else. So yeah, the people, that's my faith in them, the only people, the only entity I have faith in. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Mike.
I'll say, the month of April, obviously with the anniversary of the war next week, there's a lot going on. And I think that's what's going to really driving my inspiration. There's rallies and protests that are happening in Germany and London, across the US. In DC, there's a bunch of meetings that are happening on the Hill next week. There's events like this that are happening. So I think, people should check out what's going on social media, what's, happening on different websites. I'm working with the Sudan Peace Coalition. It's trying to put as many of these things together. And it's just people that are coming together, Sudani and non-Sudanese, who are working together to try to advocate for an end to this war, to try to raise awareness, to try to do more. And we need to keep that momentum going. Like, it can't just happen because this is the anniversary, we're entering the 3rd year of the war. Like, we need to keep this going throughout the rest of the year, and hopefully get an end to this war soon. And thank you also for having me.
Thank you.
I just want to remind everyone of the massacre of June the 3rd, when hundreds were killed, thrown in the Nile, raped, and for over 2 or 3 weeks, the military transitional council, with RSF and SAF both together, acted like the de facto like the government, torturing people, sending them to prison, detain them, and thought it's over. However, in the 30th of April, all the Sudanese rose up again.
True.
Everywhere. So the hope is there, and Sudanese always have the resilience in their heart, and we will continue our revolution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Muhannad. Megdi, any final thoughts from you?
Well, after Muhannad spoke, I'm fired up. So
Thank you.
In terms of final thoughts, I think the Sudanese have proven that those in power aren't necessarily them. We in many countries now have to realize that governments come and go, but in the end, it's the character of individuals and people who make a society. And in the Sudan, that will be the case again. And as Mike has Mandela behind him saying, it looks impossible until it's done, I think that has to be the case for Sudan.
Thank you. What a beautiful note to end on from each of you, despite a difficult conversation and despite a very serious and painful anniversary that we're coming up on next week on April 15th. I think your words have left us with a lot of nuance and reflection, but also with hope. And frankly, as a non-Sudanese who's proud to lead this institute, as an Egyptian, I think we've all across the Arab world, across the MENA region, across the world, learned a lot from the Sudanese people. And so my hat's off to you as we mark this painful day, and I'm certain there will be that future. Today's event was part of a long-term commitment by Time Up to program on Sudan. Sudan is one of our 5 priority countries, and we will continue amplifying Sudanese voices around the world across all of these issues, across the urgency of ending this war, but also beyond that, the importance of a civilian negotiating table, the importance of justice and accountability, the importance of rebuilding Sudan in a just way. I've shared in the chat for our participants a recent policy brief that we've put out that reflects some of the work that we've done. But across the Institute, you will see this week, next week, and throughout the entire year, programming on Sudan analytically through our fellowships, through the work of our legal unit, advocacy, and otherwise. So please do follow along for more content on Sudan. Please follow our speakers and moderators for their incredible insight as well. A recording will be made available, and I just want to thank our audience for the questions and active participation, our speakers and moderator for an important conversation, and the team, of course, for putting this together. Thank you.